Good morning. It's Rob from the Actors Workshop, and we are going into the 80s. Very similar to the 70s, a lot of options for you guys to go through. And one of the reasons I'm doing these episodes is for my students to be able to see how filmmaking was and how it's evolved and the acting and how they casted films and all of those kinds of things, but also watch and enjoy these older films that, once again, you may have heard of, but never checked out or never even heard of, or need to revisit. I think that's really what's important. And for the 80s, I have a ton of stuff. So we're gonna get right to it. It's 1980, and we're gonna start with a couple comedies. First one is Airplane, one of the best spoof comedies of all time. It's basically a spoof on the disaster films of the 70s, including or especially the airport films, Airport 77, etc. Really good comedy. That's number one. Next up is Stir Crazy. We see Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder put together again. We talked about Silver Streak a few episodes ago. This is a continuation to their comedic timing and genius together. This time they are wrongly accused for a crime and end up in prison. It's them trying to deal with that. It's really, really funny. It's really, really good. I like this one a lot. Not as much as Silver Streak, but it's really, really close. Um, Next, we're gonna kind of move on to like a cult classic, very similar to what we talked about the other day with Rock and Roll High School, Flash Gordon. This is the film that we talked about with Lucas trying to purchase but couldn't afford and ended up doing Star Wars. It's pretty corny, but at the same time, it's pretty classic. And I grew up with it. I really like it. It's a lot of fun. And if anybody's seen Ted, they love Flash Gordon, and you get to see some of the clips in the movie. But also Sam Jones is in it, in Ted, and it kind of popularized Flash Gordon. You need to check this out. Now we're kind of going into some heavier stuff. The Elephant Man, Anthony Hopkins, John Hurt, true story of Joseph Merrick. They call him John. It's uh, it's a sad movie, but at the same time, it kind of is happy how he was befriended by this doctor, and how the people that he used to be around and treated him so poorly, he was able to find this group of people. There was a support system, and it's a hard movie to watch, but it's worth a watch. The acting is off the charts, and the story is really powerful. Um, Another true story, on the boxing life of Jake LaMotta is the famous Raging Bull. Once again, De Niro is now in his heyday, and he's on a roll. After Taxi Driver with Deer Hunter, and now he's rolling into Raging Bull. And what's cool about this was the real boxer Jake LaMotta was on set helping with all of the story and the movie itself, and it kind of brings more of a realism and a life to this film. And it's interesting because Kathy Morality talks about how she was hired because she looked like Jake LaMotta's second wife, and she really learned about acting from Robert De Niro because he was always in her face, and hitting her and slapping her and doing all these things, and she had two choices. Either I was going to take this or I was going to fight back. And she said, I just used what I got, and I fought back. And you get some of the most intense, powerful scenes with them because of that. And that's acting 101, right? You have to use what you get to be strong. And once again, it's a heavier film, but it's a powerful film. It's a great film, and it's another true story. It's worth watching. Next up is going to be another De Palma film for me. It is Dressed to Kill, starring Michael Caine, Angie Dickinson, Nancy Allen once again. Really like this film, and as I've mentioned several times, I'm a big De Palma fan, and this goes right in line with a lot of the films that he did in the 70s and 80s. Another kind of suspense horror is The Shining. Um, this is done by, of course, Stanley Kubrick. Jack Nicholson in his legendary role, And I know most of us have probably seen this film at one time or another, but it's one of those movies you can watch over and over and over again. It's pretty incredible. Um, and it's cool because it's very different than the book in places, but it kind of has its own way being the movie that it is, and I really enjoy it, um, and I'm sure you guys do too. That brings me down to my final two, and originally on my list, I had the runner up at number one, but after thinking about it, rewatching these again, I changed my mind at the last second, which was going to be what was going to be my number one. So the runner-up for 1980 is The Empire Strikes Back. What can we say? You know, we talked about it before in the OG versus the sequel. This is as good and for many better than the original Star Wars. This copy, like the Star Wars, has the original version in it as well as the redone Lucas stuff. So yeah, we see the evolution of Han, Leia, Luke, etc. And of course, we find out that Darth Vader is Luke's dad in this one, and we introduce Boba Fett, and like we talked about before, this was directed by not George Lucas, so you have more of a friendly actor relationship in this. This is the most humanistic Star Wars film than the rest, because you have a friendly director in Irving Kershner, and you get to see a little bit more of the relationships. And for us as actors, it's all about relationships. So when you're able to have an actor friendly director, it really helps you do what you need to do as an actor. At number one is Urban Cowboy. I got this Blu-ray less than a week ago. Just came out on Blu-ray, and rewatched it. And I think this movie is really, really well done. And if you know me, I'm not a big country music fan, but the movie is so good that you forget what kind of music you're listening to. You're wrapped up in the relationships, from John Travolta to Deborah Winger. Scott Glenn as the rival to John Travolta. Just some really, really Madeline Smith, who plays Pam. I mean, just the power in the eyes and the power in the truthfulness. It really makes you have a feeling for these characters. And to me, that's the ultimate in acting, is when you're able to bring in so many different feelings and thoughts, etc., into the work. So after rewatching this the other day, it pretty much convinced me that this is my favorite for 1980. So, Urban Cowboy. All right, so now we move to the music side, and I'm going to go through a stack of CDs real quick. I know a lot of my viewers are not hard rock, heavy metal fans, but the 80s is where that genre really took off. And there's some legendary stuff in this that I wanted to point out, along with, of course, a few other different albums for the year. So we're going to start off with The Police, Zenyatta Mendata. Of course, Don't Stand So Close to Me, Driven to Tears, Do Do Do, Da Da Da. There's so many really, really strong songs on this album. So I at least wanted to mention it. Also, Billy Joel, Glass Houses, You May Be Right, Don't Ask Me Why, Still Rock and Roll to Me, Sometimes a Fantasy. This is a really, really strong album in Billy Joel's catalog, and I really enjoy it, and it was strong for 1980. I've talked about this quite a bit. For the people that know me, I've always said, and we've talked about in these episodes, that the 70s was the best era for film. I really believe that the 80s was the best era for music. And, my genre especially, of the stuff I like. A couple that I didn't bring out to show you because I had such a stack. Of course, AC/DC's Back in Black. Bon Scott died after the making of Highway to Hell in '79, and this was their, you know, comeback and change in singer and music, and it was of course a huge hit. Um, it's not my favorite ACDC, but we all know the songs and we all know the album, and I wanted to mention that. Another one that I wanted to mention that I didn't bring out is Queen's the Game. Play the Game, of course. Another one, Bites the Dust. Another very strong record. I'm going to show you a couple on the heavy metal rock side that came out in 1980 that really kind of started evolving the style of music for this period of time. So we'll start with Motorhead, Ace of Spades. A lot of people know the title track. Really strong album. Next up is Judas Priest, British Steel, Breaking the Law. Once again, people usually know that song. It's in movies, etc. But I remember being in school and seeing the little pins with this logo on it. I mean, Judas Priest, British Steel was really famous, really popular, and it's a really great album. I mean, for me personally, I like The Rage. I like You Don't Have to Be Old to Be Wise, Grinder. The list goes on. This is a really Metal Gods. It's just such a great album, and it's Priest in the heyday now. They started in the '70s, and by the '80s they were really going. These next two I'm going to talk about kind of connect with each other. And as actors, we're always talking about you have to adapt to the people you work with. So if we had a scene, depending on who you're working with, you're going to do that scene very differently because they're going to give you something different. And if you try to adapt what you're doing, no matter who the person is, based off of what the material is, it's always going to be acting. It's coming from the brain. But if you're going to adapt from the actor, it's going to change you. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because these two CDs are connected. Ozzy was fired from Black Sabbath, and he started his solo career. And he came out with the amazing Blizzard of Oz in 1980. And at the same time, Black Sabbath, with their new singer, Ronnie James Dio, came out with Heaven and Hell. And the reason that I'm bringing both of these up is because Black Sabbath didn't try to hire a singer who was like Ozzy to adapt to their music. They hired a different singer with a different kind of voice, and they adapted their sound to the singer. So in a sense, you get a different style of Black Sabbath. Yes, it's still Black Sabbath, and you still hear that music, but it's completely different because of Dio being their singer. And so it's almost like a Mach 2 of Black Sabbath now that you're getting starting in 1980 because it's a completely different Sabbath sound. And Heaven and Hell is one of the top Black Sabbath albums of all time. It doesn't matter, Ozzy, whatever. It's amazing, and that's why I wanted to bring that up. At the same time, Ozzy, working with Randy Rhoads, didn't try to create the Black Sabbath sound with his voice. He created his own sound with his voice, and so now you get a whole other venture of music because Ozzy's doing his thing and Black Sabbath is doing their thing. And you'll see this a lot. I kind of like if when bands split up or they lose people and stuff like that, that they go on to kind of do their own thing. So you kind of get this like family tree going of all these different new bands and different things and different styles you're able to listen to. And that will be a theme throughout music from this point on pretty much for me. But I wanted to point these two out together because they're connected but not connected. All right, down to my final three. I wanted to point out the first Iron Maiden album, which came out in 1980. This is their mascot. His name is Eddie, and I'm going to show you the evolution of Eddie throughout the 80s. So I wanted to at least show you the album cover. It's really strong, a really great opener. for this band. And as many of you know, it's one of my top two favorite bands behind Rush is Iron Maiden. And I want to at least talk about this album, but also show you the first Eddie, kind of a punk looking Eddie, and then it evolves into uh, a different style with every album, which is kind of cool. But the first Iron Maiden album is great. It has more of a little punky feel, you know, because in England in the late '70s, you know, punk was really strong, and you know, this album came out in 1980, and it kind of had a little bit of that hard rock punk feel to it. But still their own kind of music and style. You start to hear the melodics, the melodies and stuff in the guitars, kind of following what Priest was doing in England as well. So you kind of get a unique sound with this album where you'll start to see the changes in 81 with their next album, where you start to really hear the sound and the uniqueness of Iron Maiden start. So we'll get into that tomorrow, but I wanted to point it out, Iron Maiden. All right, my final two, and this is tough because, of course, we're always going to talk about Rush, but I went with a different one for my best in 1980 for two reasons. Number one, because I am going to have a lot of Rush on this list, but also because this album I appreciate a lot more today as I've gotten older, and that's Rush, Permanent Waves. Um, you know, of course, Spirit of Radio, Free Will, great songs, and those are songs that I've always enjoyed and thought they were great Rush rockers. But as I've gotten older, you know, you learn to appreciate Jacob's Ladder and Natural Science, Different Strings, Entre Nous. Entre Nous was one of those songs we listened to in college a lot. You know, so you know, if I go back into my high school and college days, this is by far one of my favorite albums. But it wasn't one of my favorite Rush albums back then. It's one of my top three favorite Rush albums now, because this is, you know, six songs that is just an awesome journey that I can listen to over and over and over and over and over again, and I never get tired of it. They just released a 40th anniversary edition. I just got in the mail and was listening to it just 2 days ago. So it's phenomenal. It's great, and it's my number two for 80. In most cases, it'd probably be my number one, but for this case, it's my number two. At number one is the debut album of U2. It's Boy. Quick tidbit on this cover. This cover originally was banned in the US, and so they had a different cover. On the back here, you kind of see the band members like in these clouds. They kind of did that with their faces across on the US version originally, and that's what I had on LP when I was a kid. And then when they did the re-releases, they were able to get the okay to send out the original cover. Um, it's a great rock album. And that's what I love about the early U2 album, especially the first three, is they were just a rock and roll band. They were strong, they were solid, and every song was great. My one of my favorite top three U2 songs of all time, Twilight, is on this album. Another Time, Another Place. Of course, the legendary I Will Follow. You have the Electrico. You have Anna Cat Dub. You know, Stories for Boys, Out of Control. I mean, it goes on. This is really, really strong, and it's the start to really see this band, who was going to be so powerful in the '80s, start with such a great debut album. And so when I was sitting here going through, you know, which CDs to talk about, for me, U2 Boy was the one for 1980. And then, of course, once again, on the film side, it is the classic Urban Cowboy. Like every video, go in the comment section. Let me see your list. What were your favorite movies of 1980? What are your favorite albums of 1980? I'm curious to see what other people are watching, what they're listening to. And then, of course, if you haven't subscribed, make sure you do that, and we'll see you tomorrow.